I'd like to welcome everybody to this session where we'll have an opportunity to talk about immigrant and refugee women's experiences of violence. My name's Adele Murdolo. I'm from the Multicultural Centre for Women's Health, and MCWH is a partner in the Aspire project, which is what Cathy will be presenting on today. And there are other members, of course, of the project here today. So today's session is really planned to be a discussion. So I'd invite everybody to, as we're hearing Cathy's presentation, to start thinking about how the findings of the Aspire project might translate into policy or program implementation or any other strategy, how they might translate into strategies in your worlds, because that's what we'd like to be talking about today. If anybody would like, there still is room on the tables closer to the front, so if anybody would like to move, please don't feel you're interrupting anything, but there are plenty of spaces if you would like to move more forward. I'd like to acknowledge that we meet today on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. It's my great honour to introduce to you Professor Cathy... No, Professor. You should be. Cathy Vaughan, who has led the Aspire project from the beginning. Cathy is a lecturer in gender and women's health at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health. She currently leads research projects working to improve the sexual and reproductive health of women with disability in the Philippines and to strengthen community-led responses to violence against immigrant and refugee women in Victoria and Tasmania. She's previously led projects exploring the impact of female genital cutting on women and families in Victoria, and she's currently involved in research into discriminatory acts against young people with disability, employment outcomes for people with disability, and media representations of violence against women. Cathy coordinates the World Health Organization Collaborating Centre for Women's Health, which is hosted by the Centre for Health Equity, and she teaches postgraduate courses on community-based participatory research, gender and health, and women and global health. Cathy's paper is going to be called Promoting Community-Led Responses to Violence Against Immigrant and Refugee Women in Metropolitan and Regional Australia, the Aspire project. I'd like to ask you to welcome Cathy. Sorry, I should have said that there'll be a 25-minute presentation and then there'll be time for questions. There's a giant clock here that's going to keep us on track, so we might end up with about 15 minutes. Yeah.
There really is a giant clock there. It's quite intimidating. Thanks, Adele. I would also like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people who've been custodians of this area for thousands of years, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders and families. I think it's important that we all acknowledge the disproportionate impact of violence on Australian Indigenous people and recognise the resilience and strength of Indigenous women and children living with the consequences of family violence. I'd also like to recognise the strength and resilience of immigrant, refugee and asylum-seeking women now living in Australia, and to acknowledge women's and communities' efforts to respond to violence when the wider system often doesn't. Before I start with this presentation, I do want to acknowledge that it's being made on behalf of a team. So that's myself, Erin Davis, Deb Waugh and Karen Block at the University of Melbourne, Adele, Jasmine Chen and Regina Chiazon at the Multicultural Centre for Women's Health, and Linda Murray from the University of Tasmania. We've got a strong working relationship and throughout this project have developed really strong friendships as well, for which I'm very grateful. It's a great team and all questions can be directed to them. It's great. Okay. All right. So almost 28% of Australians were born overseas and many, many more have at least one parent who was. And it's an incredibly diverse population. So it does include many Brits and Kiwis, but still almost 20% of Australians were born in countries where English is not the first language of the majority of the population. So it's not a small and exotic minority group. it's a big population, and it's a population who should be front and centre of our responses to family violence. While research has certainly been done with immigrant and refugee women in Australia, given the size of the migrant population, there are distinct limitations to the body of work. Far more work has been done with women who are refugees than with women who've come from other streams of the immigration program, for example. Most research has tended to focus on a specific cultural community in a particular place, so with Liberian women in Adelaide or with Thai women in Brisbane. And while that work has provided in-depth and really rich evidence about the experience of the participating communities, there's been less work done across groups to try and look at system-wide issues across different cultural groups. And the body of work that looks at the experiences of many immigrant and refugee women who live outside our capital cities is quite small. So that has informed how we're thinking about the Inspire project. I'd also like to highlight that there's been quite a lot of research done where refugee women in particular have been involved in the collection of data as part of projects. And I know there's a number of people in the room who've worked with refugee women to collect data. I think with our project, we're also trying to involve migrant and refugee women in the design of the project, in the design of our tools, in our data analysis and dissemination strategies, as well as the collection of data. And I think that there's been perhaps limited focus on identifying opportunities for community-led responses to family violence amongst different migrant and refugee communities. So those factors underpin the design of the Aspire project. And while I don't pretend for a minute that one research project is going to be able to address all of those gaps, we do hope to make a contribution to increasing understanding about the nature and dynamics of violence against immigrant and refugee women in different Australian contexts. And specifically what we're interested in are what immigrant and refugee women's experiences are of family violence and of help seeking in different geographic locations, trying to understand about the local barriers and facilitators to immigrants and refugees accessing violence prevention and support services in different settings, and trying to understand what opportunities exist for supporting community-led responses to family violence against immigrant women. The first step in informing our research design and in contributing to the evidence base that's being developed by ANROWS has been an assessment of the current state of knowledge of the field, or a literature review. And as Cathy said this morning, it's quite hard to make that fascinating, but I'll do my best. So our State of Knowledge report, which is available online at the ANROWS website for people who are interested in it, we developed that earlier last year, and it was published late last year. I should say that the grunt work of identifying and screening the enormous amount of potentially relevant literature was done by Erin Davis and Jasmine Chen, and I really think that given over 3,000 records were screened, they deserve a particular nod for that work. You can see the process that we went through of searching through a number of different databases for looking for records that were potentially relevant to understanding migrant and refugee women's experiences of violence, then screening those papers, removing ones that were sort of peripheral to the issue. For example, there's a lot of work around HIV that peripherally talks about violence, but is not specifically around violence, and then decided which papers we would include in the synthesis for our report. And in the end, we included 133 studies from the peer-reviewed literature and 28 pieces of documents from the grey literature. So the peer-reviewed literature that we included publications from Australia, Canada, and a number of European countries, including the UK. And surprisingly, there's not much literature from the UK. I was expecting more from the UK, but there isn't much. The largest proportion of literature that we included came from the US, and that was even after excluding certain papers, for example, work that was looking specifically and only at the experience of Hispanic and Latina women, which we decided to exclude because of the very specific historical and sociocultural context of cross-border migration in the US, which is quite different to the experience of migrant refugee women resettling in Australia. The grey literature that we included was key national documents, as well as material that was specifically relevant to Victoria and Tasmania, which are the two states this study is being undertaken in. And these included policy documents, research undertaken by community organisations, some of whom are represented in this room, project reports and evaluations and so on. And then we developed a data extraction template to enable the team, and the labour was divided evenly across our team, to appraise the quality of the research that we were finding. And that data collection template meant that we looked at the appropriateness of the methods, the validity of the tools, whether the study was adequately described and people were transparent about the limitations of the work they'd done, and then to try and really look at the content and the depth and usefulness of the findings of that research and whether they contributed to understanding gaps in the literature. And from that process, we can see that there are a number of limitations to the work. For example, a lot of studies are only undertaken in English. And so if you're working with migrant and refugee women, that excludes a large proportion of the women that you're trying to reach from participation in the research. Often studies had quite small sample sizes, and then very large claims were made on the basis of these small sample sizes about all migrant and refugee women's experiences. Sometimes data was collected direct from interviews and so on with service providers rather than directly engaging with women themselves. And the prevalence data, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute, is particularly unreliable for immigrant and refugee women, and there's a whole range of reasons for that. Okay, we undertook a process of thematic synthesis where we looked at themes that were present across that body of literature and pulled that together. And our analysis of that work was underpinned by the theoretical concept of intersectionality and a social ecological approach to understanding family violence. I've realised now that that's quite hard to read, but this map, which is in the report that you can see online, talks about the 4 main themes that were present in the literature that we reviewed. So a body of work was looking at women's experiences of violence that talked about prevalence, but also the forms of violence that women were experiencing and the consequences of that for their health and well-being. There was another body of work that looks at factors that are associated with women's vulnerability to experiencing violence. Sometimes that was around pre-migration factors, but it was also around immigration policy and visa status, community attitudes and social pressures of different cultural communities, gender roles and norms, social isolation and so on, influence of religion and other factors that affect other women in terms of increased likelihood of experiencing violence, such as pregnancy. Then we had, there was a smaller body of work that looked at women's experiences with help seeking and the responses that they were receiving. So what sort of things made it easier or more difficult for women to seek help, what their experience of the justice system or domestic violence system was, and around risk assessment and how risk assessment was or wasn't being adapted to the needs of migrant and refugee women. And finally, we did look for prevention literature, but as I'll say in a minute, there's not much out there in relation to these populations. So, overview of the literature. So, first of all, to talk about prevalence, sometimes people say that immigrant and refugee women experience higher levels of family violence than other women in the community, and they may, but they may not. The current state of knowledge is we just can't say. The quality of the prevalence data is poor. There's a whole range of difficulties with prevalence data. Immigrant and refugee women are often underrepresented in national survey data, such as things like the Personal Safety Survey, because if women don't speak English, there's often not accommodations made for that in survey studies. Survey instruments might also conceptualise family violence in ways that are not recognised by immigrant and refugee communities. And of course, some women are reluctant to disclose their experience of violence to cultural outsiders, such as people conducting surveys. And while it's true that immigrant and refugee women may not conceptualise family violence in a way that can be captured in a yes-no response to some of the survey questionnaires that are used around the world, nonetheless, across that body of work that we looked at, immigrant women did have a broad and nuanced understanding of family violence, including physical, sexual, emotional, financial and other forms of violence. But similarly to the wider Australian community, this understanding is not homogenous within and between the communities, and it evolves over time, and it certainly is affected by contact with services. Women often had a greater vocabulary to talk about their experience after they'd been in contact with services. Immigrant and refugee women experience the same forms of family violence that other women do, but in addition, women report specific types of violence that are not experienced by other women in the community. So, for example, women report violence in the form of control and threats associated with immigration status. So where women are on temporary visas or on a spousal visa and their residency rights are attached to that of their husband, then that is a form of violence when they're given misinformation, not given information, and threatened with deportation. Perpetrators also use, there's really kind of extremes of social isolation that are made possible when women have no family or friends in a country, don't speak the language, can't drive, and so on. There's also higher levels of multi-perpetrator violence, so that's violence perpetrated not just by partners but also in-laws and extended families, and this was reported in the literature as well. The impacts of family violence on immigrant and refugee women are similar to those experienced by other women, though the length of exposure that women would describe was often longer than for other women in the community, and that increases the risk of physical and mental harms that are experienced by women. It's very consistent across the literature that immigration policy and women's immigration status has an overarching impact on their experiences of violence and their ability to seek help. And this was something that came out through countries that have similar immigration systems to Australia and others that had a different approach to immigration, but consistently, if a woman has insecure residency rights, that increases her vulnerability to violence. Women's vulnerability is also experienced by attitudes in her cultural community and social pressures that might include expectations in relation to marriage, religious customs, normalisation of violence, fear of being alienated from their community, and so on. And there's a sizable body of work that talks about the impact of shifting gender norms. So that is where families have migrated from countries with very traditional patriarchal systems, and where the change that that family experiences upon migration causes stresses and strains in a family, and how that affects women's vulnerability to violence. Okay. And I think just to highlight with the gender norms that some researchers would find that often the greater rights and equality and access to justice that women experience after migration was protective in relation to family violence, but other researchers would highlight that there was sometimes quite violent resistance to men's sense of masculinity being undermined, and factors such as men's and underemployment or experiences of racism that undermine traditional male privilege. Immigrant and refugee women experience multiple barriers to accessing services, and these include the obvious language barriers and unfamiliarity with the system, but also actual or perceived racism and bigotry, and in contemporary contexts a lot of that bigotry was associated with Islamophobia. Ambivalence towards police, so reluctance to engage with authorities because of difficult experiences with authorities in countries of origin, and the sort of scant evidence around the benefits of pro-prosecution approaches for women, immigrant and refugee women. Women often seek help from family and community members in the first instance rather than from formal services. And some violence response services are perceived as culturally unsafe. So women were unable to pray, they were unable to access the food that they needed to eat in some of the traditional violence response services. Conversely, some culturally specific services have really poor understandings of violence, and there was quite a bit of literature about multicultural services or settlement services trivialising women's experiences of violence, not having a good understanding of the role of gender inequality, for example. And women, across the literature, we were finding that immigrants and refugee women have complex and multiple service needs, so immigration, settlement, housing, a whole range of needs in addition to needs for sort of stopping the immediate violence. And as I said, there is very little literature around prevention and engaging with men and boys in the immigrant and refugee communities. So just to reiterate the aims before I talk about where we're at with the Aspire project. So we're interested in women's experiences, we're interested in the local barriers and facilitators to accessing services, and we're interested in what opportunities might exist for supporting community-led responses. Our data collection tools and processes will help us to assess relationships between women's experiences of violence, help seeking, access to services and where they live. So we're deliberately looking at women who live in inner city locations, outer metropolitan situations and regional centres, given particularly the rapid growth of resettlement of migrants and refugees in regional centres around Australia. We're looking at the impact of immigration status. So what type of visa is a woman on? How long she's been in Australia? Do women have access to social networks of support? Are people coming into really established communities, or is it a newly arrived community? Looking at demographic factors, so that's about the age difference between men and women, what the current relationship is, what type of marriage it was, whether it was arranged and so on, and also the household composition. Are women living with their partners and children or with parents-in-laws, sisters-in-laws, brothers-in-laws in extended family settings? We've asked women about their experiences of violence before migration, about their knowledge of relevant laws and services and where they can get help, and about the different types of experience that that we know that immigrant and refugee women are subject to, but also about other factors that are known to affect vulnerability to violence, such as disability, pregnancy, levels of education of both the man and the woman, and socioeconomic factors. And we're doing this work in 8 sites, 5 of them in Victoria and 3 of them in Tassie. And we're particularly interested in how women's experiences intersect with place, particularly differences and similarities that there might be in the experience of women living in locations that are well served by domestic violence services compared to women living in regional settings where there might be fewer options for them. So just to explain, inner northwest Melbourne is a bit of a tricky, doesn't neatly fall into one local government area. So we're really talking sort of Carlton, North Melbourne, Flemington, inner northwest Melbourne that cuts across City of Yarra, City of Melbourne and Moonee Valley for people who are from Melbourne. In each research site, we're using a range of qualitative methods to collect in-depth place-based data. So we're doing in-depth interviews with immigrant and refugee and asylum-seeking women who've experienced family violence to look at their experiences of migration, resettlement, their relationships and family life, and their experiences of family violence where they sought help and so on. Our key informant interviews have been, and I'm looking around, I'm sure there's some people in the room who've been interviewed, with service providers, and that includes domestic violence services, but law and justice, health, housing, resettlement, multicultural services and so on, to look at the challenges that service providers face in working with immigrant and refugee women, the strategies they've developed and what they see are the priorities for improving responses. We've conducted focus group discussions with prominent cultural communities at each site, with women and men separately. Mostly these have been ethno-specific group discussions, but we have had a few that have been mixed multicultural discussions where this has pre-existed the project. And then we're conducting a Photovoice project with community leaders. So Photovoice is a research tool that's based around participant-generated photography where participants can communicate their perspectives through photographs and words. And this component of the project will commence soon and will involve working with community leaders to share their perspective on why family violence is important in their community and how they think their community could be better supported to respond, particularly in relation to prevention. And I should say here we're taking a very broad view of community leader, noting that sometimes traditionally recognised community leaders are a substantive part of the problem in relation to violence against women, and that often women demonstrate extraordinary leadership even if they're not in formal leadership positions. So that's what we're doing, a little bit about how. This photograph's taken during a training of one of the groups of bilingual bicultural workers that we're working with, in this case at MCWH. Oh, I've done something quite extraordinary there. Okay. We are working with bilingual and bicultural workers who've given input into our tools and methods and giving us advice around how questions would translate, how they would be interpreted in their community, the appropriateness of asking certain questions and how you might get to that with different groups. And all of the bicultural workers that have been involved in the project then have also participated in a structured training to ensure that we're all on the same page in relation to family violence, but also around qualitative methods and how you do interviews, how you facilitate focus group discussions, and that everyone's across the very extensive safety protocol that's been developed for this project. So we're working with bilingual health workers from the Multicultural Centre for Women's Health, but also from the Australian Red Cross in Tasmania and the Migrant Resource Centre down in Hobart. The team can collect data in over 20 languages, I think it's about 26 actually, across the 2 states. They're amazing, these women that we're very lucky to be working with. Okay. So what this means is that we've been able to conduct focus groups in a large number of different languages as appropriate to the communities in the different locations. And we've been able to offer women a choice of whether they'd like to be interviewed in their mother tongue or whether they would prefer to be interviewed by an outsider through an interpreter, or whether they would prefer to be interviewed in English. And I should note that in some instances, the bicultural workers have done interviews in English with women from other cultural communities, not necessarily their own, and we recognise that they bring a whole lot of skills and expertise to Aspire rather than in addition to their language and cultural expertise. So where are we at? So far we've conducted 32 in-depth interviews with immigrant and refugee women who've experienced violence, 41 key informant interviews with service providers, and facilitated 26 focus group discussions with just under 200 participants. I think we only want to do about 2 or 3 more key informant interviews and 2 or 3 more focus groups, and perhaps I think there's 5 or 6 in-depth interviews that are still planned. We're almost there. Erin, send them to Erin. And I should highlight that while we've taken a very place-based approach to interviewing service providers working in Dandenong or Launceston, for example, and holding focus group discussions with members of local communities in each site, we've been much more flexible with our recruitment of women for in-depth interviews. So immigrant, refugee and asylum seeker families move around a lot. You add that to the mobility of women who are experiencing or have fled domestic violence, and the relationship with place gets quite complicated. So we've had women who, when they were in the violent relationship, might have been living in Caroline Springs in Melbourne's west, but actually sought services in Dandenong. And so we've included women from a range of sites, including women who live on Melbourne's sort of growth corridors, so Craigieburn, Werribee, the sort of outer fringes of Melbourne, where services are really overstretched and struggling to deal with the big population boom in that part of the state. So, similar to Cathy, we don't have findings, but we, as a team, talked about, do we have any early reflections that we could share? So I should emphasise that these are very early musings. Data collection is ongoing. The mammoth task of transcribing and translating data is ongoing, and we're obviously at a very early stage of our analysis. But we'd like to raise some issues for discussion now with the group. So, first of all, this qualitative study doesn't enable us to say whether immigrant and refugee women are more likely to have experienced severe violence than other women. But the women that we've interviewed have often survived really quite extreme and severe violence. Often that's been enabled by the nature of their social isolation. So the Iraqi woman, married at 13, arriving in Australia at 19 without English family or friends, not seeing outside her house for 3 years. The Punjabi woman, having known her husband for 2 hours prior to marriage, arrives into a house with multiple in-laws and is choked by her husband within 48 hours of being in the country. She has no phone, no internet, and no idea where in Melbourne she lives. The multi-perpetrator violence, where women experience violence from their partner, parents-in-laws, sister and brother-in-laws and sons, and where young women's behaviour is violently policed by fathers, brothers and cousins. We want to highlight that with the often large families living in small and overcrowded housing, kids are witnessing this violence and the violence is being normalised. There's been little attention paid in the literature to the needs of immigrant and refugee children in circumstances of family violence, and these are kids who are often already dealing with trauma, or at the very least the upheaval and cross-cultural challenges associated with migration. Given what we know about childhood exposure and intergenerational recurrence of family violence, the importance of this cannot be overstated. In response to Anna Bligh's terminology yesterday, though I'm not sure if this is a sharp spear because it does seem to be something that requires more the size of a mallet, we must emphasise how immigration policy makes women vulnerable. When women who may have been active contributors in their home country, educated professional women, are made dependent on a man on their arrival in this country, when her residency rights, economic rights are tied to his visa, we make them vulnerable. When refugees arrive and we prioritise men receiving English classes over women because they'll need a job. Not that it's as blatant as that, but there's never enough childcare, so the women do have to wait. We increase power imbalances in that relationship right from the get-go, and we make women vulnerable. When we change the rules around which visa classes are eligible for what services every 5 minutes, leaving overstretched service providers who cannot be expected to be migration agents and immigration lawyers completely confused and throwing their hands up, we make women vulnerable. I think it's a mallet rather than a spear, the issue of immigration policy. Other specific factors that we've found that increase women's vulnerability include resettlement in rural and regional areas without supports, and so I'm very much looking forward to the next presentation and intersections with Sarah's work around rural and regional contexts. Situations where marriage is largely a transactional relationship, and this includes a whole range of situations where there's been an exchange of bride price, dowry, sponsorship for migration, business relationships between families and so on, also increase women's vulnerability. And on the services and response side, one sharp spear that does need to be thrown, it relates to interpreters. There's not enough of them, there's often not enough funding to engage them, they're inadequately trained to interpret in response to family violence work, and there's no monitoring of the quality and professionalism of their work. Some of them are downright dangerous. And those that are good, and don't get me wrong, we have heard about many interpreters who are good, and there are a lot of them, numerous accounts of the treasured Vietnamese interpreter at the Sunshine Court, or of the one Karen interpreter who covers the whole of Tasmania 24 hours a day. They're amazing, but they are inadequately supported to deal with the burden of interpreting in relation to family violence work day in and day out, and there's a really high risk of burnout. Without access to high-quality professional interpreters, immigrant and refugee women are literally silenced in the system. And I should add, this is true of other women who need communication support, including women with disability, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this in other sessions. Other issues that have come to the fore so far in relation to relate to the lack of diversity in workforces responding to family violence. Immigrant and refugee women don't tend to see themselves reflected in the staff of DV services, in women's health services, in the police, the courts and so on, and that can increase women's perception that this service is not meant for them. Women also experience inconsistent responses across services. They might have a positive experience with specialist police family violence units, for example, but they experience racism on a regular basis from the local police that they deal with day to day. Some services can pick up when the interpreter is not interpreting, but rather pressuring a woman to go back to her husband, but others do not. Some health workers insist on seeing a woman alone. Others, even in situations of termination of pregnancy, do not question whether the procedure they are about to do might be forced and ask the man who's hovering over the crying woman, who he claims can't speak English, to leave. It's really hard for women to have confidence in services when there's such inconsistency. And there's very little, the last point there's very little out there in the way of prevention programs and options for culturally and linguistically diverse men who use violence. There are very, very few targeted men's behaviour change, and it's unclear whether and how existing programs need to be adapted to address beliefs formed in the highly patriarchal and violent societies that some men have grown up in. Services for men themselves are few and far between. And I haven't put it on the slide because I know everyone in this room knows, but funding. Funding to accommodate the complicated needs of immigrant and refugee women is just not there. So that services that are already, as you all know, that are so stretched, it can be hard to respond to immigrant and refugee women until they're in crisis. So they, before that stage, often slip through the cracks. So we are hoping that Aspire will generate information that can be used in promoting community-led responses, and that's around identifying existing initiatives, and there are some amazing initiatives being led by women from different cultural communities in the settings that we've engaged with. We want to understand more about the evidence, more evidence about barriers to inform advocacy efforts, understand more about women's priorities and needs, and about women's leadership in response. I think we hear a lot about culture when talking about family violence against immigrant and refugee women, and it's true that there are some issues that are cultural that increase women's risk. But Aspire is working with women and communities from diverse cultures, from different continents and different socioeconomic situations, following different religions, and we see a lot of similarity across the group. These experiences are structural, not just cultural, and we can't ignore them. So in conclusion, to say that immigrant and refugee women are a very large proportion of our population, and they make up a sizable percentage of service users, particularly in crisis. Their issues are not fringe issues. They need to be considered across all of our work in cities, in rural centres, in legal and justice responses, in housing, in healthcare settings, in relation to technologies, in our work with disability, with women in same-sex relationships, in addressing the needs of children. Does consideration of immigrant and refugee women and their children cut across all of these areas, all of our responses to violence against women? I'm not sure that they do. I think we must do better. I'm glad Cathy reminded me I had to put that up.
Thanks so much for that, Cathy. We started a little late, so we don't have a lot of time for comments, but I think that Cathy's given us lots to spur our thinking about what kind of spears we might want to throw in relation to this issue. We do have time for some comments though. Would anybody like to... We thought about this issue as being divided perhaps into national initiatives, state-based, and then perhaps organisational and local kind of strategies that might help the situation. Does anybody have anything to contribute in relation to one of those? Thanks, Rhonda.
Rhonda Garrard from Women's Health in the South East. I'm actually really interested in Cathy's response to a structural issue around how is it that publicly funded population-based research can continue to be allowed to ignore up to a third of the population in the case of migrants, but women with disabilities, women in rural and remote environments. How is it that we continue to allow this? And is there anyone really advocating for change at a structural level in this matter?
May also hand this to Adele. It's gobsmacking, and it's partly around things like data collection, for example, and how that's done, but it's also just the way we think about responses to family violence. So, for example, with the Royal Commission hearings here in Victoria, where there was kind of one day, and we were talking about it as kind of the odds and sods day, there was one day where it was around women with disability, immigrant and refugee women, all lumped into the one day, whereas it should have been cutting across the whole 3 weeks. You know, how did the needs of immigrant and refugee women be addressed in all of the things that were discussed at that Royal Commission rather than sort of a peripheral side issue? In terms of leadership on advocacy around that, I mean, I think Multicultural Centre for Women's Health do a lot of speaking out on this. I know Women with Disabilities Victoria, People with Disabilities Australia also speak with considerable frustration and anger at this, but I think it's sort of beholden on all of us to say this is just not okay. We're not talking about sort of, you know, a teeny tiny minority. This is a lot of people. Yeah, it's our taxes.
Any other comments?
Hello, thank you for the presentation. My name's Sue Underhill from Southern Domestic Violence Service in South Australia. One of the issues I also think for women is that often they're not only have they migrated to this country, facing then the domestic violence, but for particularly in the southern region of Adelaide, we have many women then that have to settle away from their communities to be safe in areas that may not have the services, etc., or the communities of origin in that region. So for women and children then to have to almost resettle and migrate again because of safety, I think is an issue to consider and we're focusing on that down in the south at the moment of Adelaide. But any comments about that kind of sense of multiple resettlement?
Yes, certainly the women that we've interviewed describe that they would be living in one, and we know that women who experience violence move around and are deliberately moved around for their own safety. But when that involves leaving your entire cultural community, I think we underestimate the impact of that on women's mental health and wellbeing. And that of the kids. So I would only agree. And I am really interested in the next presentation around rural and regional settings because of the push to resettle, particularly the arrivals through the humanitarian stream in regional centres. They're often really ill-equipped to deal with that, and it's happened very quickly. So if we look at Tassie, for example, the resettlement of humanitarian stream arrivals in Tasmania is a reasonably recent phenomenon, and it's in the context of Tasmania, it's large scale, and the services just aren't there to support them.
I'm sorry, thank you for offering to ask more questions, but we've got a big red sign here saying that our time's up, so I think we have to finish up. Could I just quickly say, somebody asked me to say there's a film in this room at lunchtime, which is a wonderful film about 20 years of a domestic violence service, which has been by Aboriginal women in South Australia. So please come back to there. And I'd like you please to join me in thanking Cathy for that wonderful presentation. And enjoy your next session.